stabilization on the Western Front made all the belligerent powers very anxious to find some way to break the stalemate. So they tried all kinds of imaginative ways to attempt it. There were various new technologies that all the Europeans tried. The Germans tended to be particularly imaginative in the early years. So all these new technologies, with the exception of aerial bombardment, started with the Germans. All of the major countries had submarines in their navy, but they hadn't been used all that much. Germany decided to unleash unrestricted submarine warfare in 1915, and that involved attacking merchant ships indiscriminately, whether or not they could defend themselves. And that was meant to be part of the war of attrition, to put pressure on the enemy country's production capability by reducing their supplies coming into the country. But use of submarines that way was in direct violation of treaties that the European countries had signed late in the 19th century and 1890s. There was a treaty that stipulated how naval warfare was supposed to take place. There was supposed to be a certain process in order to let the crew of the ship you're attacking try to escape. But a submarine is a small thing, and it's pretty vulnerable to even relatively small shipboard guns. So if you're going to use a submarine effectively, you can't reveal yourself to even a merchant ship that has only some small guns on it. So unrestricted submarine warfare gave them free rein to attack without warning. And a lot of people around the world, this was another PR disaster for Germany. A lot of people around the world saw that as tantamount to murder, just simply murdering defenseless people on the high seas. So, but that was a magic bullet aspect of trying to break the stalemate. It didn't really work, although it certainly was terrifying. And it did reduce that Germany never had enough U-boats, enough submarines to win the war that way, but it certainly was terrifying for anyone traversing the ocean that they might get attacked by a submarine. Chemical warfare, another attempt to try to break the stalemate on the front. The Germans were the first to use poison gas. There had been warring countries that had used gas before in warfare, but not poison gas. Gas was usually used for either concealment purposes or for psychological warfare. But this time there were chemicals put in the gas to try to choke people. And the Germans first tried to use it on the Eastern Front, which when they first tried to use it, it was too cold, and so it actually froze and then came back at them. But in 1915, at Second Ypres, the Germans used chlorine gas, and it worked quite well at first, although the Allies developed countermeasures quite quickly. And so even though gas was this terrible weapon that caused people to die horribly, it didn't really change the situation because it was too easily countered. And so very quickly troops developed gas masks, or armies developed gas masks and things like that to counteract it. Aerial bombardment, both as a means of trying to damage the enemy from the air and as a means of psychological warfare, ramped up in 1915 and 16. I'll talk about the air war more in another unit, but aviation was generally seen as kind of a recreational activity before World War I, but it very quickly became a very deadly military activity, also very psychologically imposing. So the Zeppelins were airships. They're mostly filled with gas, so even though they were big things, it's not like they could hold a lot of bombs. So the first Zeppelin raid attacked some coastal towns over Britain, and they destroyed some buildings, and I think they killed one person or maybe two or three in that first raid. But the extent of the damage from Zeppelin raids wasn't really that much, but it was psychologically terrifying. This is a time when aviation was brand new, and the idea of death raining from above was something that really freaked people out. And so the psychological effect of the Zeppelins was much more important than any damage any of the Zeppelin raids actually did. I think there were a couple dozen Zeppelin raids from Germany to Britain throughout the war. None of them particularly damaging, but they were more psychological than anything else. And flamethrowers, something the Germans also introduced, a way to try to clear the trenches out. Definitely a brutal way to kill an enemy soldier, burning them to death. But again, the flamethrowers weren't particularly effective, even though they were terrifying weapons. And so all these means of trying to search for magic ways to get through the front, they didn't work, although they did introduce terrifying aspects to warfare that didn't exist before. The problem all the warring countries dealt with was supplying their armies. In the first few months of the war, there was a serious shell shortage that was difficult for the both the Allies and the Central Powers to keep up with. Just the sheer amount of ammunition they were using, particularly for their artillery pieces, they couldn't keep up with the production. And so it took a number of months to tool their factories in such a way to produce the amount of ammunition needed and supply in general for the soldiers. It was surprising to the extent they were able to do this pretty quickly. It inconvenienced their populations to some degree, so there was definitely an emphasis on increasing factory production. France in particular did the best job it could trying to make the rest of the population not suffer too much because of the war, and there were various ways they did that. Germany suffered worse since it was under pressure from having Britain blockade it. They definitely had more shortages of supplies and raw materials than the Allies had, who had access to trade via the ocean. So, but just this image gives you a sense of just how demanding the war was on supply, and over time how your entire economy eventually became focused on producing material for the war in order to destroy the other side's material that they're using for the war. Another way of trying to break the stalemate was to try to find allies that would add to your forces. And so Italy joined the war in 1915 on the side of the Allies. They had flirted with joining the Central Powers, but they decided to join the Allies since they thought they would get a better deal out of joining that side. Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. So in all of these cases, the countries thought, we're going to get something out of this. We're going to get more out of this. We're going to get more land. We're going to get more resources available. We're going to be able to take something that we lost in earlier years, take it back. And so the countries that got into the war after it started generally did so for some kind of personal gain that they thought they could get. And in all these cases, they didn't really come out well. Italy didn't really have a huge impact on the war, and most of the battles it fought in were disastrous on the Italian front. Had several battles that went very badly for it. Bulgaria, it had interest in joining the Central Powers because basically the Central Powers promised it a huge chunk of Serbia if they won, and so Bulgaria stood to gain a lot, but also ended up suffering because the war was lost by the Central Powers. And then the Ottoman Empire probably lost the most. And the fighting in Turkey itself was part of the search for somewhere else to take pressure off the Western and Eastern fronts. The British in particular were obsessed with this idea of opening up a new front in some other part of Europe. Winston Churchill was particularly interested in opening up a front in southeastern Europe, and Winston Churchill at the time was First Lord of the Admiralty during the first half of World War I, and he was a supporter of both the Salonika campaign and the Dardanelles campaign, or Gallipoli campaign. And the idea behind both of those was to create a new front. In the Salonika campaign in Greece was to create a front on the Austro-Hungarian frontier. and pull troops away from the Western Front that way. So hopefully Germany would send more troops to Southeast Europe and away from the front. And that the Greek front, it didn't really accomplish what they wanted. Basically, it was a stalemate there. Bulgaria was heavily involved, and the Allies didn't really accomplish anything with that, although they did send quite a few troops. And then the Gallipoli campaign was a huge debacle. This was an example, or the first major amphibious campaign. And the idea was to take away the most strategic sea access to the Mediterranean and Black Sea, which would deal huge damage to the Central Powers if the Allies could fully control the Dardanelles Straits. And they attempted a landing on the Dardanelles Straits and on the Gallipoli Peninsula, and that landing did succeed in landing some troops, and the mostly British troops held a tiny little spit of land at the very end of the Gallipoli Peninsula, and they fought for months trying to hold on to it. But eventually, and this was kind of a situation where not holding the high ground cost them. They had this lower ground, and they weren't able to get over these hills off the beaches. And so the British troops, and a lot of them were Imperial British troops from the Commonwealth countries like Canada and especially Australia and New Zealand, fought this just losing battle, just a continuous stalemate where they continued to lose troops against the Turkish defenders who had better positioning. And eventually, at the end of 1915, they just started an evacuation. In fact, the most successful operation of the Gallipoli campaign was the evacuation from Turkey. They managed to do that in secret and were able to evacuate almost all the troops within about a week and a half without letting the Turkish defenders know they were evacuating. And then they were just suddenly gone, which was quite the operation because if the Turks had attacked when the evacuation was going on, it would have been extremely casualty intensive. So this is in the documentary as well.